There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a Missouri courthouse square on a Tuesday morning in April, when the ground is still cold and the oak trees have not yet decided whether to bud. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of men who have already made up their minds and are waiting for the formality of the world to catch up with them. It is the silence of farmers who have been farming long enough to know which land is worth fighting over and which land is not, and who can tell the difference from 40 feet away without setting a boot on the soil. On the morning of April the 9th, 1963, that silence held 37 men on the steps of the Calloway County Courthouse in Fulton, Missouri. They stood in the thin spring light with their hands in their jacket pockets and their breath making small clouds in the air, and they were waiting for the county clerk to begin the tax-delinquent land auction that had been advertised in the Fulton Sun for 3 consecutive weeks. Most of them were not there to buy. They were there because in a small agricultural county, a tax auction is a social event, a chance to see which of your neighbors had finally gone under, and to calibrate your own position relative to the wreckage. The property on the block that morning was described in the county tax records as 120 acres, unimproved, located on the southeast drainage basin of Calloway County, Missouri, parcel number 7741-B, assessed value $4,200, back taxes owed $2,600, minimum opening bid $3,000. The assessor's office had classified the land as marginal agricultural, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that 3 separate owners had tried to farm it over 40 years, and all 3 had eventually walked away. The local name for it was simpler. Everyone in Calloway County called it the Sunken 40, even though it was 120 acres, because the 40 acres at the center of the property sat in a natural bowl below the surrounding terrain and held standing water from late November through early June in an average year and through late August in a wet one. Gideon Pruitt had owned it last. He was 61 years old and had farmed it for 11 years and had managed to plant a full crop exactly 4 times in that span. He had tried corn and it drowned. He had tried winter wheat and the standing water rotted the roots before January. He had tried soybeans in the higher corners and gotten decent yields on maybe 30 acres, while the other 90 sat useless. He had fallen behind on his property taxes in 1959, made a partial payment in 1961, and by the spring of 1963, the county had seized the land for $2,600 in arrears. Gideon was standing at the back of the crowd that morning too, not because he wanted to watch, but because a man who has spent 11 years on a piece of ground has trouble walking away clean. He was there to see it go, maybe to make sure it really went. Dale Whitmore was standing near the front. Dale was 52 years old and had been the dominant commercial presence in Calloway County agriculture for the better part of 2 decades. He ran the largest farm equipment dealership in a 4-county radius out of a converted feed warehouse on Highway 54, John Deere franchise, Alice Chalmers parts, and a secondary operation selling and financing used equipment that had grown in some ways larger and more profitable than the primary business. He was a big man, wide through the chest and shoulders, with a handshake that he deployed like a tool and a voice that carried across open spaces without apparent effort. He knew the financial position of nearly every farmer in the county because he had either sold them their equipment or loaned them money to buy it, or both, and he filed that information away in a mental ledger he kept updated as carefully as any bookkeeper. He was there that morning because he knew things. He knew the Sunken Forty's problem was not the soil. He knew the soil was some of the best in the county. He knew something else too, something that was not in any county record or assessor's file, something that had made him and two other men in that crowd quietly interested in ensuring that this particular piece of ground did not fall into the wrong hands. Caleb Marsh was standing at the very back of the crowd, slightly apart from the others, a position that suited him. He was 26 years old, which made him the youngest person at that auction by at least 15 years. He was not a big man. He was lean in the way that men who do physical labor outdoors through all 4 seasons of a Missouri winter tend to become lean, which is a leanness that has nothing decorative about it. He wore a canvas work jacket that had been patched at both elbows and washed enough times to lose its color, and work boots that were clean, because he had cleaned them that morning, because he understood that what you wear to a courthouse matters even if what you own does not. He had driven 45 minutes from the rented room he kept in a house outside of Oxvass because he had seen the advertisement in the Fulton Sun and had spent 6 days thinking about what it said. Marginal agricultural, 120 acres, southeast drainage basin. He had driven out to look at the property twice before the auction, once during the day and once at dusk, because the way water moves across a piece of ground tells you different things at different times of day and in different light. He had walked the perimeter. He had pushed a steel fence post into the earth at 47 different points across the property to measure the depth of the topsoil above the hard pan. He had followed the natural drainage lines with his eyes, and then with his feet, and then with a length of string he stretched between stakes to establish the actual grade of the ground. He had found what he was looking for on the second visit. On the eastern boundary of the property, where the land met a shallow drainage easement that dated to before the Civil War, there was the remnant of what had once been a constructed outlet channel, a hand-dug trench approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, now silted and overgrown with cattails and scrub willow, that had clearly at some point served as a controlled drainage outlet for the low ground at the center of the parcel. The channel ran for 300 yards before it disappeared under a berm of compacted earth and stone that crossed it at a right angle. The berm was not natural. It was not a road. It was not a levee in any legal sense. It was a dam, roughly built but effective, and it had been built at the edge of the neighboring property owned by a man named Vernon Holt. Caleb had stood at the base of that berm for a long time in the fading light, reading what he saw the way his father had taught him to read ground, which was slowly and without hurry, and with your eyes moving from the small details to the large picture and back again. He had driven home in the dark and sat at the kitchen table in his rented room and written 2 columns of numbers in a spiral notebook. The first column was what the property would cost and what it would take to make it work. The second column was what the property would return if it worked. He had looked at both columns for a long time. Then he had closed the notebook and gone to bed because the numbers were clear and there was nothing more thinking would add to them. He had $4,800 in a savings account at the Calloway County Bank. It was every dollar he had accumulated in 8 years of working other men's farms for wages that started at $1.40 an hour and had risen through a combination of skill and reputation to $2.10. He had never owned a car that cost more than $300. He had never taken a vacation. He had never bought anything he could not justify with math. The $4,800 represented 8 years of his life converted to currency and held in a passbook account, and he was about to spend every dollar of it on a piece of ground that 37 farmers and one county assessor had collectively decided was not worth farming. The county clerk opened the auction at 9:15. He read the parcel description in a flat, bureaucratic monotone that drained all drama from the numbers and asked for an opening bid at $3,000. A farmer named Hendricks from the north end of the county bid $3,100. A second man bid $3,200. There was a pause. Then a thin man in a grey coat, who Caleb did not recognize, bid $3,400. And the pause that followed that bid was longer. The crowd shifted. People looked at each other. $3,400 for 120 acres of swamp was already more than the land was worth by most measures in that county. Dale Whitmore, from his position near the front, did not bid. He was watching. Caleb raised his hand. $4,800. The silence that followed was a different kind than the silence at the start of the morning. It was the silence of surprise. The particular surprise of watching someone do something that everyone in the room has already silently agreed nobody would do. 36 heads turned toward the back of the crowd. The man in the grey coat looked at Caleb for a moment and then looked away. Nobody else raised a hand. The county clerk asked twice more if there were any further bids, his voice carrying the pro forma patience of a man who has done this many times and knows when a room is finished. Sold. 120 acres, parcel 7741-B, $4,800. The county clerk did not say congratulations. Caleb signed the deed at a folding table set up inside the courthouse. His hand was steady. The cashier's check he had drawn from his account that morning took everything. When he walked out of the courthouse with the deed in an envelope tucked inside his jacket, he had $11.40 in his wallet and 120 acres of mud and standing water to his name. He was the first person in his family to own land. He stood on the courthouse steps for a moment in the April light and let that fact exist inside him without rushing it. Then he walked to his truck. Dale Whitmore met him at the bottom of the steps. Dale extended his hand, and Caleb shook it, because in Calloway County, you shook Dale Whitmore's hand when it was offered, the same way you acknowledged weather. It was a force of nature more than a social choice. "Caleb," Dale said, "heard you just bought yourself a pond." He laughed at his own joke, in the way men do when they want you to know they are not entirely joking. 120 acres, Caleb said, of which 40 is underwater and 30 more might as well be. Dale pulled his hand back and hooked his thumbs in his belt. "You are 26 years old, and you just spent every dollar you have on the worst drainage problem in this county. Now, I have sold equipment to every serious farmer in Calloway County for 20 years, and I will tell you what I tell all of them. A man needs the right tools for the ground he is working. I have got a 1960 John Deere 3010 on the lot right now. 4-cylinder diesel, 55 horsepower. She will handle that clay better than anything you could find used. I can put you in it for $6,200 on a 36-month note." Caleb looked at him. "I have got a tractor." Dale's expression did not change, but something behind it did, very slightly, in the way a river changes when something heavy is dropped into it, and the surface recovers, but the current underneath has shifted. "What have you got?" A 1951 Farmall Super M picked it up from Elwood Crane's estate in January, $310. There was a pause. "Caleb," Dale said, and his voice was patient in the way that a man's voice becomes patient when he is choosing his words for reasons the other person cannot see. "You just bought the worst ground in this county. It is underwater 4 months out of 12 in a good year and 6 in a bad one. The clay, when it finally dries, will crack open and swallow your equipment. 3 men have tried to farm that ground before Gideon Pruitt and every one of them gave up or went broke. And Pruitt lasted longer than the others and still lost 11 years of his life and $2,600 in back taxes. And you are going to work it with a 12-year-old farmall that you bought for $300. I am saying this to you plainly because I think you are a young man, and you deserve to hear plain talk. You are walking into a failure that has already happened to 4 other men. The only question is how long it takes. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at a point past Dale's left shoulder, at the bare oak trees along the courthouse square, and he had the expression of a man who is listening to 2 conversations at once, the one being spoken to him and the one happening inside his own head. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "I have got a different understanding of that ground." "What understanding?" "You will see," Caleb said. He walked to his truck. He did not look back. In the rearview mirror, as he pulled away from the courthouse square, he could see Dale Whitmore standing at the bottom of the steps, hands still hooked in his belt, watching him go. It was not the posture of a man who was dismissing what he had just seen. It was the posture of a man who was filing it away. To understand what Caleb Marsh did next, you have to understand where he came from. Not just the geography of it, which was Audrain County first, then Boone County for 2 seasons, then the series of rented rooms and seasonal farm jobs across 5 counties that eventually brought him to Calloway, but the interior of it, the framework of understanding that his father had built inside him, before Caleb was old enough to choose whether to accept it or not. Earl Marsh had been a tenant farmer for the entirety of his adult life. He had never owned an acre of land. He had rented it, worked it, improved it with his own labor, and then watched someone else benefit from the improvements when the lease was not renewed or the owner sold. He had moved his family 6 times in 14 years, always following a lease that seemed better than the last one, and always finding, once he got there, that the problems on the new ground were merely different from the problems on the old ground rather than smaller. He had been a quiet man and a patient one, and he had not been a man who complained, but the thing that ate at him, the thing that Caleb understood only in retrospect, was not the poverty of tenant farming. It was the impermanence. You could pour 10 years of your life into a piece of ground, and someone else could end that relationship in a conversation, and you would have nothing to show for it, except the knowledge of what you had done. Earl had tried to pass that knowledge to Caleb in the only way he knew how, which was by taking the boy with him into the fields from the time Caleb could walk, and narrating what he saw there. "Feel how the water pools here," Earl would say, pressing Caleb's hand into the soil at the edge of a low spot. "Feel how it goes soft? That is where the hard pan is close. That is where the water cannot go down, so it sits. You remember that." Or they would walk a field after a heavy rain, and Earl would read the patterns of standing water the way other men read weather forecasts, with the certainty of accumulated experience that no book had given him. "Water does not lie," Earl told him more than once. "Dirt can fool you. Seed can fool you. Weather will fool you every time you trust it. But water always goes where it goes. You learn to read water, you learn to read land." Earl Marsh had died in November of 1954, when Caleb was 17 years old. A tractor rollover on a rented farm in Audrain County, a hillside that had been wet from 3 days of rain, a decision made too quickly or too casually, or perhaps not made at all, just the ordinary inattention of a tired man near the end of a long season. The owner of the farm had sent a card to Caleb's mother, Nora, expressing his condolences, and a letter 2 weeks later asking the family to vacate the property by the end of December. That was what tenant farming gave you. The man who worked the land his entire life, who knew every acre of it, who had drained a low corner and rebuilt a fence line and repaired the equipment shed with his own lumber on his own time, was gone. And 30 days later, his family was asked to leave. Not because the owner was a cruel man, because that was the arrangement. You farm my land, you live in my house, and when you cannot do those things anymore, the house goes back to me. Caleb had carried that letter in his wallet for 2 years after his mother moved to live with her sister in Colombia. He had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He was not carrying it to feed his anger, though there was anger in him. He was carrying it as a reminder of the one thing he had decided, clearly and without ambiguity, before he was 18 years old. He would own the ground he farmed. He would own it outright, or he would not farm at all. He would not borrow to buy it, because a borrowed piece of ground was still someone else's ground in the way that mattered most, which was that someone else could take it from you. He would save until he could pay cash for something, and that something might not be good ground, might not even be ground that looked promising, but it would be his. 8 years of farm labor had been the mechanism of that decision. He had worked for wages on 9 different farms across 5 counties in central Missouri. He had spent 2 full seasons in Boone County on a large operation east of Columbia, working ground that ranged from good upland to difficult bottomland. And it was there, on an October afternoon, when a foundation contractor cut a trench through a clay seam near the barn and stopped work to call someone from the university, that he had first seen white industrial clay pulled from Missouri soil and understood in a general way that the geology of the basin country held things that the surface did not advertise. He had filed that observation away without urgency, the way a man files things that have no immediate application but feel worth keeping. He had never turned down overtime. He had never spent money on anything that did not serve a direct purpose. He had studied every piece of ground. He worked as if he might someday own it, which in a sense was true, because the knowledge of ground accumulates the same way money does, slowly and then all at once. And when the right piece came available, you needed to already have the understanding in your hands. He had been looking at the Sunken 40 in the Fulton Sun advertisement for 3 days before he drove out to see it, and he had known within the first hour of walking its perimeter what it was. It was not a swamp. It was not marginal agricultural land. It was a drainage problem with a specific cause and a specific solution, wrapped in the appearance of failure so complete that no one had looked past the surface of it. Caleb drove from the courthouse directly to the Sunken 40. He parked his truck on the county road and climbed the fence and walked to the center of the property, to the low point where the standing water was deepest. And he stood in the April mud with the water pulling at his boot soles and looked at what he owned. The water was maybe 18 inches at its deepest here, in the bowl, clear near the edges and brown with suspended clay at the center. The surface was still. The surrounding land rose gently in all 4 directions, and you could see, if you looked carefully, the way the grade fell toward this point from every angle, channeling every inch of rainfall from 120 acres into this one low bowl with no exit. The clay hardpan beneath the topsoil was impermeable. The water that reached it could not go down. It could only spread sideways and evaporate, and in the cool, wet months of a Missouri spring, there was more coming in than going out, and it simply sat. His father had taught him to see what was under the water. So he looked. The topsoil, where the water was shallow enough to observe, was dark, nearly black, the kind of dark that meant decades of organic material accumulated in conditions that would have been excellent for growth if the growth had not been drowned before it could complete itself. Under that organic layer was Putnam silt loam, a soil type common in this part of Missouri and extraordinarily productive when properly drained, capable of yields that would put good upland ground to shame. The farmers who had failed here had not failed because the soil was bad. They had failed because the water had nowhere to go, and they had not known how to give it somewhere to go, or had not had the patience to try. Caleb knew how to give it somewhere to go. He had known since the second time he walked this property and found the remnant of the old outlet channel on the eastern boundary and traced it 300 yards to the point where Vernon Holt's earthen berm had blocked it, probably sometime in the 1940s, based on the vegetation that had grown up around it, and he had understood immediately what the berm was, and what it had done, and what its removal would mean. If that outlet channel were cleared and the berm removed, the water in the Sunken Forty would have a natural gravity drain to the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of both properties. The grade was sufficient. He had measured it twice with a surveyor's level borrowed from a man he knew in Oxvasse. 3 inches of fall for every 100 feet of channel length, more than enough to move water efficiently. If the channel were cleared, the standing water in the bowl would drain within weeks. The water table in the surrounding acreage would drop within a season. By the second year, he would be able to plant the full 120 acres. The math was simple and brutal and beautiful. 120 acres of Putnam silt loam, properly drained in 1963 in Calloway County, Missouri, should produce 60 to 70 bushels of soybeans per acre in a normal year. At current prices of $2.20 per bushel, that was between $132 and $154 per acre per year. Over the full property, that was between $15,800 and $18,400 in annual gross revenue. His land cost had been $4,800. The drainage work would cost him labor and time and whatever tile he needed for the lower areas, but the main outlet channel, if he could clear it and remove the berm, would cost almost nothing. The berm was earth. He had a tractor. He had a blade. He stood in the water for a long time. A red-tailed hawk was working the air above the far tree line, rising on a thermal, not hunting, just rising. He watched it until it cleared the trees and disappeared into the blue. He had one problem. The berm was not on his land. It sat at the edge of Vernon Holt's property, technically within Holt's boundary, and it had been there long enough that Holt might well have a legal claim to it as a water management structure, even if it had been built without authorization, and even if it was causing measurable harm to the downstream property. The law around drainage disputes in Missouri in 1963 was complicated in the specific way that agricultural law tends to become complicated when the interests of neighbors diverge over something that moves across property lines the way water does, which is without asking. Caleb had thought about this for 6 days before the auction. He had gone to the county courthouse and looked at the plat maps and the drainage easement records and found the original 1887 survey that documented the outlet channel as a recorded drainage easement, which meant it was not Holt's to block in the first place. He had made notes. He had talked to no one about it because in small agricultural counties, information is a kind of currency, and he was not in a position to spend any. He had bought the property anyway, because the outcome of the drainage dispute was uncertain, but the underlying value of the land was not. Even if the berm dispute took years to resolve, there was enough high ground on the property to plant 30 to 40 acres while the legal situation worked itself out. And if the dispute resolved in his favor, the other 80 acres of standing water would become some of the most productive ground in the county. He had not shared this thinking with anyone, not with the county clerk, not with the other bidders, not with Dale Whitmore. He drove to Dale Whitmore's equipment dealership that afternoon, not because he needed equipment, because he understood that in Calloway County, Dale Whitmore was the information infrastructure, and Caleb wanted to know what Dale knew without letting Dale know what he knew. It was a negotiation, even if no goods or money were involved. It was the kind of negotiation that happens between men who are assessing each other, establishing the boundaries of what each will reveal and what each will protect. The dealership occupied the better part of an acre on the south side of Highway 54, a main building and 3 outbuildings surrounded by rows of equipment in various states of age and repair. The smell of diesel and grease and cut metal hit you before you got out of the truck. Inside, the showroom floor held 2 new John Deere tractors under fluorescent lights, their green paint so fresh it seemed almost aggressive, and along the back wall, a parts counter behind which a young man in a green apron was cataloging boxes. Dale came out of his office when Caleb walked in because Dale always came out when someone walked in. It was one of the things that made him effective. He made every visitor feel as if their arrival had been anticipated and was welcome, which created an obligation of reciprocity that he was very good at converting into commercial outcomes. He shook Caleb's hand again. Same grip, same duration. "Caleb Marsh," Dale said. "Come to set up an account." "Just looking," Caleb said. "I wanted to see what you had in used equipment. 2-row planter, disc harrow, maybe a grain drill." Dale walked him through the used equipment lot behind the main building and talked about each piece with the fluency of a man who understood machinery at a molecular level, which in fairness, Dale did. He knew what every piece on that lot had done, who had owned it, what its weaknesses were, and what it would take to make it serviceable. He was not dishonest about the equipment. That was part of what made him trusted. He was honest about machines and strategic about everything else. As they walked, Dale talked about the county, about the spring planting outlook, about which farmers had had good years and which had not, about the equipment market and the price of soybeans, and what the extension office was saying about this year's weather pattern. He was gathering information while appearing to give it, and Caleb understood this and played his role in the conversation carefully, offering observations that were general enough to be useless while listening to everything Dale said, with the specific attention of a man who is reading the ground. What he heard under the talk about machinery and weather and market prices was something he had not fully accounted for. Dale mentioned Vernon Holt twice in passing, both times in a context that was casually positive, the kind of easy familiarity that exists between men who do business regularly. He mentioned the names of 2 other large operators in the county, the Garland family, and a man named Cussler, in similar terms. And when he spoke about the southeast drainage basin, the part of the county where the Sunken 40 sat, he spoke about it in the tone of a man describing a region of fixed and permanent characteristics, as though its status as poor draining bottomland were a feature of geology as immutable as the river itself. "You are going to find that ground responds slowly," Dale said, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over the equipment lot. "I have seen men put equipment in that low ground in spring and not get it out until July. The clay will eat your tire treads, and the yields, even when you can plant, they are not what you would get on the upland. That is just the nature of the drainage basin down there." Caleb nodded and asked about a 1955 2-row corn planter and listened to Dale's assessment of its condition and thanked him for his time and drove away. He drove directly to the county surveyor's office and asked to see the drainage easement records for Section 14 and Section 15 of the southeast quadrant of Calloway County, which included both his property and the Holt property. The clerk found the records in 40 minutes. The 1887 survey was there exactly as he had found it the previous week. The outlet channel was documented as a recorded drainage easement appurtenant to the parcel that was now his, meaning it was a legal right of drainage that ran with the land, not with any individual owner. Holt's berm had not been authorized. It had not been recorded. It had simply been built, and built in a location that blocked a recorded easement. Caleb asked the clerk for a copy of the survey and the easement record and paid 35 cents for it and put it in the same envelope as his deed. He drove out to the Sunken 40 one more time before dark. He walked to the eastern boundary and stood at the base of Vernon Holt's berm and looked at it in the last light of the day. It was maybe 5 feet tall and 20 feet wide at the base, compacted earth with some stone mixed in, grown over with fescue grass, and a few small cedars that had seeded themselves into the top. By the number of cedar trees and their size, Caleb estimated the berm had been there at least 15 years, long enough to have killed any possibility of farming the Sunken 40, long enough that whoever built it had probably stopped thinking about it as a deliberate act and had filed it under the general category of landscape. He put his hand against the earth of the berm. It was still cold, deep, April cold, the kind of cold that lives a foot below the surface even after the air has warmed. He could feel it through his palm. He thought about his father standing on rented ground and reading the water and the letter in 30 days, and the hawk that had been rising on the thermal above the tree line that morning without any particular destination. He thought about the way his father had said it many times in many versions, but always arriving at the same place. Water goes where it goes. Learn to read it, and you learn to read land. He was reading it now. He could see exactly where the water needed to go. He could see the path it would take if the path were opened. He could see, with the clarity that comes from years of training your eye on a specific problem, the farm that existed inside this swamp, waiting with the patience of earth itself for someone to show it the way out. He was 26 years old, and he had $11 in his wallet and 120 acres of muddy water to his name. He drove home in the dark. He sat at his kitchen table and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote one line at the top, April 9th, 1963, day 1. Then he began to plan. He listed what he had, 120 acres in his name, the 1951 Farmall Super M parked behind the house he rented, which ran well because he kept it running well, which was a discipline he had learned from watching other men lose good equipment through neglect. A set of hand tools, a borrowed transit level from the man in Oxvass, which he would need to return and then find a way to borrow again. The surveyor's copy of the 1887 drainage easement, which was a legal document and therefore a weapon, though he did not know yet whether he would need to use it or whether the situation would resolve itself more quietly. $11.40 in his wallet, $0 in his savings account. He listed what he needed: a disc harrow to break the upper ground on the 50 acres that were currently farmable or close to it, seed soybeans for the coming season, which he would have to buy on credit from the co-op because there was no other way, tile for the lowest sections of the property where gravity drainage alone would not be sufficient, maybe 2,000 feet of it, maybe 3, depending on how the survey grids worked out when he ran them. And time. Time was the resource that appeared on neither the expense side nor the income side of any ledger, but that governed both of them more completely than any dollar figure. He had time. He was 26. The ground was not going anywhere. He listed the problems in order of their severity. The berm was first. not because it was the most immediate obstacle to planting, but because it was the structural problem on which all other problems depended. As long as the berm stood, the outlet channel was blocked and the 40-acre bowl at the center of his property remained a pond. He could work around it. He could plant the higher ground and accept lower yields and build his capital base and wait for the legal situation to resolve. But the berm was the thing that had defeated 3 men before Gideon Pruitt and had defeated Gideon Pruitt himself over 11 years, and Caleb was under no illusions about what it represented. It was not just an earthen obstruction on the eastern boundary. It was a decision someone had made, deliberately, and that decision had a human face behind it that he did not yet fully understand. He would understand it. He would take the time to understand it completely before he moved in any direction that he could not move back from. His father had taught him that too, in his quiet way, through the example of a man who had spent his life moving carefully across ground that did not belong to him, and who had survived every difficulty except the last one through the combination of patience and precision. "You do not dig until you know where the pipe runs," Earl used to say. And he did not mean it only about pipes. Caleb closed the notebook. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the Missouri night was black and cold, and the stars were clear in the way they get in early April when the air has cleaned itself after winter. He thought about the hawk he had watched that morning, rising on the thermal above the far tree line, not hunting, just rising. He had watched it until it disappeared, and he had felt something that he did not have a precise word for, which was the feeling of a thing going exactly where it was meant to go. He understood water. He understood ground. He understood the difference between a problem and a failure, which was that a problem had a solution waiting inside it, and a failure was what you called a problem after you stopped looking for the solution. The Sunken 40 was not a failure. It had never been a failure. It was a drainage problem with a legal complication and a human obstacle and a specific solution that no one who had owned it before had been equipped to find. He was equipped to find it. His father had spent a lifetime handing him the tools for exactly this. Not the physical tools, not the tractor or the borrowed level, but the seeing. The way of looking at a piece of ground and reading what was actually there, rather than what other people said, was there. He went to bed at 10:30. He set his alarm for 5 in the morning. There was ground to walk before the light got too high, and in the low areas along the eastern boundary where the outlet channel ran, the early morning light came in at an angle that made the old drainage patterns visible in the surface of the soil in a way that the midday sun flattened out. He had one more thing to verify before he was certain. He wanted to be certain. He was 26 years old, and the worst land in Calloway County, Missouri, was his, and tomorrow was day 2. The first thing Caleb Marsh did on the morning of April 10, 1963, was walk the eastern boundary of his property in the angled light of a Missouri dawn, and what he found there confirmed the last thing he needed to confirm. The old outlet channel, the one documented in the 1887 county survey, ran true and clear for its entire length of 300 yards before it met the berm. The grade was better than he had estimated from his earlier measurements, closer to 4 inches of fall per 100 feet than 3. The channel bottom, where it had not silted over, was still hard clay, packed by a century of seasonal water flow, which meant the structure of it was sound, even if the surface was choked with reed grass and willow root. He could clear it with the farm awl and a drag blade in a week, maybe less. He stood at the base of Vernon Holt's berm in the morning light and looked at it one more time. In the daylight, at this hour, with the dew still on the fescue grass that had colonized its surface, It looked almost natural. That was the thing about man-made obstructions when enough time passed over them. They stopped looking like decisions and started looking like geography. They started looking like the way things were instead of the way things had been made to be. He put that thought away. He walked back to his truck and drove to the Calloway County Co-op on the west edge of Fulton and asked to speak to whoever handled new account applications. The man behind the counter was named Harold Estes, 50 years old, the kind of careful, unhurried man that co-ops in agricultural counties tended to produce, men who had seen enough seasons of boom and failure to strip all urgency from their manner and speak to every farmer who walked through the door with the same measured patience, regardless of whether that farmer was buying $1,000 of seed or 2 bags of lime. Harold looked at Caleb's new account paperwork and at the deed copy Caleb had brought as collateral documentation, and he looked at the description of the property, and he looked up at Caleb. "The Sunken 40, Harold said. It was not a question. "That is the property," Caleb said. Harold was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man doing arithmetic in his head. And the arithmetic was not only financial, he was calculating something more complex, which was the probability that this young man in a patched jacket sitting across the counter from him would be in a position to pay his co-op account at the end of a growing season on a piece of ground that Harold had personally watched 2 farmers leave in debt. He approved the account for $500 of credit. He did not say what he was thinking, because that was not his way. Caleb bought seed soybeans, a soil test kit, and 300 pounds of potassium fertilizer on the account. He loaded them in the bed of his truck and drove to the Sunken 40 and spent the rest of the morning taking soil samples from the 20 grid points he had marked with stakes across the higher ground, the approximately 50 acres that were above the waterline and potentially plantable that first season. He packaged the samples and mailed them to the University of Missouri Extension Office in Columbia, because he wanted to know exactly what the soil was before he put anything in it. That was the kind of thoroughness that costs time and rewards patience, and Caleb was constitutionally incapable of acting on guesses when facts were available. He had the results back in 12 days. The Putnam silt loam on the upper portions of the property tested at a pH of 6.1, slightly acidic, and showed moderate potassium deficiency and adequate phosphorus levels. The organic matter content was exceptional, among the highest the Extension Office had recorded in that soil type in Calloway County, which was the direct result of decades of waterlogged organic material decomposing in anaerobic conditions that preserved it rather than burning it off. The soil that had been drowning for 40 years had, in the process of drowning, been quietly accumulating fertility that no farmer had ever been able to access. Caleb read the results at his kitchen table and felt something that was close to satisfaction, which was the feeling of a calculation confirming itself. He had known the soil was good. Now he had numbers that said so. He applied lime to adjust the pH and worked the potassium fertilizer into the upper 40 with the farmel and a disc harrow he had borrowed from a farmer named Tate on the north side of the county, a man who owed Caleb a favor from a winter of helping with equipment repair. He planted his first soybeans on May the 7th, 1963, 6 weeks after buying the property in the 38 acres of upper ground that were dry enough to work. It was late in the planting window, but not too late. He drove the farmall in long, straight rows and watched the seed go into the dark soil behind him, and felt the weight of the decision he had made settle into something that was neither fear nor confidence, but simply commitment, which is what those two things become when there is no going back. He did not touch the berm, not yet. What happened next was not what Caleb expected, though in hindsight it should have been. He had understood the drainage problem with precision. He had understood the legal situation with reasonable clarity. What he had not fully understood was the human dimension of it, which is always the dimension that surprises you, regardless of how carefully you have read everything else. He found out about it the way most things get found out in agricultural counties, which is not through confrontation, but through the sideways current of talk that flows through co-ops and equipment lots and church parking lots and the corners of feed stores where men stand for 20 minutes longer than they need to before they get back in their trucks. The talk found him in early June, when he was at the co-op buying a second bag of inoculant for a late replanting on a corner that had not germinated well, and a farmer he did not know well, a man named Blevins from the east side of the county, stopped him in the parking lot and said something that he said casually, the way men say things they consider common knowledge. "You know Vernon Holt runs the water off his bottom ground through your east boundary," Blevins said. "Has done for 20 years. That berm he built backs the water up in your field and lets it move slow across his low ground toward the creek. You take that berm out, Holt loses his natural drainage for 300 acres. Caleb stood with the bag of inoculant in his hands and looked at Blevins and kept his expression neutral. "And Whitmore," Blevins continued, looking away toward the highway in the way men do when they are saying things they are not sure they should be saying. "Whitmore and Garland and Cussler, they have all got tile lines that tie into Holt's system. You are sitting on the drain point for the biggest private drainage network in the southeast end of the county. Nobody told you that when you bought." "Nobody told me much of anything," Caleb said. "Nobody wanted to," Blevins said, and he got in his truck. Caleb stood in the co-op parking lot for a moment after Blevins drove away. The June air was warm and smelled of cut grass and diesel and the particular metallic sweetness of a Midwestern summer building toward its height. He was thinking about Dale Whitmore standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps on the morning of the auction, shaking his hand with that familiar grip. "I have got a different understanding of that ground. You will see." He was thinking about the way Dale had not bid. He was thinking about Vernon Holt and the Garland family and a man named Cussler, who he had not met and did not know, but whose tile lines, apparently, terminated in his property, in the water that was drowning his crops, in the mud that had defeated 4 farmers before him. This changed the arithmetic considerably. He drove to the property and walked the eastern boundary again, this time looking not at the outlet channel and the berm, but at the Holt ground on the other side of the fence line. He walked it slowly, from the berm south toward the creek and then north along the property line for 200 yards, and what he saw when he looked at Holt's low ground was exactly what Blevins had described. The terrain on Holt's side of the fence was wet in the low areas, but not standing water wet, slow wet, the kind of wet that indicates controlled drainage, water that is being managed rather than pooled. He could see, if he looked at the grade, that Holt's low ground drained toward the fence line rather than away from it. There were 3 buried tile outlets on Holt's side that daylit into the drainage ditch along the fence. Outlets that had been placed to move water from Holt's tiled fields into the slow drainage path that crossed the corner of Caleb's property before reaching the creek. The berm was not just blocking Caleb's outlet channel. The berm was the control structure for a drainage system that served Holt and 2 or 3 other large operators in the basin. It kept the water level on the Sunken Forty high enough that water from their tiled fields could drain into it and flow slowly across it toward the creek, without needing the pumping infrastructure that proper drainage would have required them to build and maintain at their own expense. Caleb's 120 acres was their free drainage basin. His flooded fields were their infrastructure. He understood now why Dale Whitmore had not bid at the auction. Dale did not need to own the property. He needed it to stay problematic, to stay wet, to stay in the hands of people who would fail on it and sell it eventually to someone who would continue to fail on it. The Sunken 40 was worth more to Dale and Holt and the others as a failed farm than it would ever be worth as a successful one, because a successful farm would require its owner to drain it, and draining it would destroy the drainage system that 4 large operators in the basin had spent 2 decades building on someone else's land without paying for it. Caleb stood at the fence line for a long time. The afternoon was warm, and the creek along the eastern boundary was running clear, and the red-winged blackbirds were working the cattails along the water with their particular urgent energy. He thought about his father. He thought about what it meant to be a man who spent his whole life on someone else's ground, and what it meant to be a man who built infrastructure on someone else's ground and called it his own by the simple authority of never having been challenged. He was going to challenge it, but he was going to do it correctly. In July of 1963, Caleb drove to the law offices of a man named George Pell in Fulton. Pell was 60 years old and had practiced agricultural and real property law in Calloway County for 35 years. He was not the most prominent attorney in the county. He was the most accurate one, which was a different thing, and in Caleb's estimation, a more useful one. Caleb laid the 1887 survey, the easement records, and a hand-drawn map of the current situation on Pell's desk, and explained what he had found and what he believed it meant. Pell put on his reading glasses and studied the documents for 15 minutes without speaking. Then he took his glasses off and folded them on the desk. "The easement is real," Pell said. "Recorded appurtenant, runs with your land. The berm is unauthorized. Holt has no right to maintain a structure that obstructs a recorded drainage easement on an adjacent property. That is clear. What is less clear is what you can do about it quickly. Holt will argue the berm is a water management structure on his own land, and that he has a right to manage drainage on his property as he sees fit. His lawyer, whoever that is, will find the most favorable interpretation of that argument and present it to a judge who may or may not have had occasion to think carefully about drainage easement law. This could move fast, or it could move very slowly, depending on who we draw." "How slowly?" Caleb said. Pell looked at him. 2 years. Maybe 3 if he appeals. Caleb was quiet for a moment. 2 years of planting the high ground and leaving 40 acres underwater. 2 years of half yields while Dale Whitmore's tiles drained into his field. He thought about the math. It was survivable. Painful, but survivable. "File the complaint," he said. Pell filed the complaint in August of 1963. By September, Vernon Holt had retained a lawyer from Columbia, a man named Driscoll, who specialized in agricultural water rights, and the response to Caleb's complaint was 40 pages long and argued, with considerable technical sophistication, that the berm constituted a legitimate water retention structure under Missouri statute and that the 1887 easement had been effectively abandoned through non-use for more than 20 years. It also argued that removing the berm would cause significant downstream flooding on Holt's property, damage that Holt's legal team estimated at $38,000. Caleb received the response at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in October. He read all 40 pages twice. Then he made a cup of coffee and sat at the table for a long time in the quiet of the rented house with the October wind coming off the fields outside and the pages spread in front of him, and thought about 40 pages of legal argument designed specifically to keep his 40 acres underwater. He was not defeated by this. He was not even particularly surprised by it. But he felt it, the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of ground when you push a post into heavy clay, and the clay does not yield the way you expected. It was a specific kind of resistance that told you something true about what you were working against. It told you the resistance was real, and it was organized, and it had resources that he did not have. He took his case to the First Circuit Court of Calloway County in the spring of 1964. The hearing lasted 2 days. The judge, a man named Whitfield, who had been on the bench for 18 years and had the particular patience of a man who has sat through a great many agricultural disputes and understands them as the permanent background condition of rural life, rather than as emergencies, listened to both sides with equal attention and ruled 3 weeks later in Holt's favor on the preliminary injunction. Holt could maintain the berm, pending a full trial on the merits. The trial was set for the following spring. Caleb walked out of the courthouse for the second time in 2 years with a piece of paper in his hand that was not what he wanted. He stood on the same steps where he had stood in April of 1963 with the deed in his jacket and $11 in his wallet. And he looked at the same courthouse square with its same oak trees which were budding now in the April warmth. And he was quiet inside himself in the way of a man who has accepted an outcome without accepting defeat, which are two different things. He had planted soybeans again that spring on the upper 40. He would harvest them in the fall. He had a crop. He had a farm. He had a legal case that had suffered a temporary setback and would continue. He had time. What he did not have was any way to anticipate what was going to happen next, because what happened next came from a direction he was not watching. In the summer of 1964, while the legal case moved through the slow machinery of circuit court scheduling and deposition calendars, Caleb continued to work the upper portion of his property and to look every day when he walked the eastern boundary at the berm. He had begun to understand it not as an obstacle, but as a teacher, the way every problem that you cannot immediately solve becomes a teacher if you are patient enough to let it. The berm was showing him the drainage system it was part of. Every heavy rain revealed new information. He walked Holt's fence line after every significant rain event and watched the water movement and sketched the flow patterns in his notebook until he had a reasonably complete map of how water moved across the entire southeast drainage basin. Not just his property, but the connected system of fields and tile lines and natural channels that the berm controlled. He also began to tile his own lower ground. Not the 40 acres in the bowl. Not yet. Those required the outlet channel to be cleared before tiling would help. But the transitional zone between the upper ground and the bowl, a band of maybe 15 acres that was not underwater but was wet enough to reduce his yields significantly, he began to tile that ground in the fall of 1964, working evenings and weekends after the harvest, cutting trenches with the farmhand and a homemade tile plow he had built over the winter from a moldboard plow and a piece of heavy angle iron. He bought tile from a manufacturer in Moberly, 1,200 feet of 4-inch terracotta at 4 cents a foot. He laid it himself on his knees in the trenches, fitting each piece, backfilling with pea gravel from a gravel bar in the creek. The work was quiet and physical and absorbing in the way that all work is absorbing when it is also meaningful. He worked in the evenings until he lost the light, and then he worked by lantern light on nights when the ground was stable enough to see by. And on Saturdays, he worked from first light until he could not see his hands. Nobody watched him do this work. The county road ran 200 yards from the nearest point of his operation, and the sight of a man working ground in the fall evening was not unusual enough to attract attention. He was invisible in the way that men who do patient work are always invisible, right up until the moment when the patient work announces itself. In the fall of 1964, Caleb harvested his second crop off the upper 40. The yield was 39 bushels per acre on the tiled transitional ground and 31 on the untiled upper sections. The county average that year was 27. He was outperforming the county average on the worst-rated land in the county. It was not spectacular, but it was proof. He did not say anything about it to anyone. He took his grain to the elevator in Fulton and deposited the check in his account at the Calloway County Bank, and drove home and opened his notebook to the page where he kept his running figures and wrote in the new numbers and looked at them for a while and then closed the notebook. The trial in the circuit court took place in April of 1965. It lasted 3 days. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table with George Pell and listened to Holt's lawyer present 40 pages of argument, supplemented by expert testimony from a hydrologist from the University of Missouri, whom Driscoll had retained and who testified at length about the potential for downstream flooding if the berm were removed. Caleb had spent 40 hours preparing for the cross-examination of that hydrologist, reading everything he could find about Calloway County drainage history and the specific hydrology of the Southeast Basin. And when Pell cross-examined the expert on the third day, Caleb handed him the questions he had prepared on index cards in sequence and watched Pell deliver them with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was asking. The hydrologist was good, but his model was based on assumptions about downstream channel capacity that Caleb's field observations had already contradicted, and Pell, guided by Caleb's notes, found the contradiction and exposed it cleanly. Judge Whitfield ruled from the bench on the 5th day. He found in favor of Vernon Holt on the primary question of the berm's legitimacy as a water management structure. He found against Holt on the question of the easement, ruling that the 1887 drainage easement was valid and had not been abandoned, and that Holt had no right to permanently obstruct it. He issued a narrow order requiring Holt to provide Caleb with access to the outlet channel for the purpose of drainage maintenance, while the broader question of the berm's future was referred to a special master for further fact-finding. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was a door opened halfway. Caleb thanked George Pell in the parking lot of the courthouse and drove directly to the Sunken 40 and walked to the outlet channel and began to clear it by hand with a brush hook and a flat spade, because the court order gave him access for drainage maintenance purposes, and he intended to use every inch of that authorization immediately. He worked for 4 hours in the April afternoon, cutting reed grass and digging out silt and exposing the original clay channel bottom, which was exactly where it should have been and exactly as sound as he had thought from his initial assessment. The channel was not broken. It was buried. There was a difference. He cleared 80 yards of channel before the light gave out. He drove home and ate and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook. He was not happy exactly, because happiness in Caleb Marsh was not a loud thing. But there was something in him that was aligned in the way a grade aligns when you set your transit level and the bubble centers itself, and you look down the sight line, and the slope is exactly what the calculations said it would be. Everything was where it should be. The work was proceeding in the direction it should proceed, slowly, correctly. He did not know that Vernon Holt had driven out to the eastern boundary of his property that same afternoon and watched Caleb work in the channel for an hour before driving back to make a phone call. He did not know who Holt called. He would find out 6 weeks later, and what he found out would change the shape of everything he thought he understood about his situation. The summer of 1965 was dry. In a dry year, the Sunken Forty's problems shrunk considerably, because a dry year reduced the inflow to the bowl, and by mid-July, 6 weeks into the dry spell, the standing water in the 40-acre depression had receded to a series of shallow pools at the lowest points rather than the continuous sheet of water that a normal or wet year produced. Caleb walked the bowl for the first time since buying the property. The soil under his feet was wet but firm, and what he felt through his boot soles in those areas where the ground was firm enough to carry his weight was something that made him stop and stand still for a moment. The soil was extraordinary, dark and dense and rich with the particular quality of ground that has been accumulating organic material for decades. He pushed his hand into it up to the wrist and pulled it back and held it in front of him and looked at the color of it and the texture of it. This was not marginal ground. This was not the soil of a failed farm. This was some of the most productive earth in Missouri, locked away underwater that had nowhere to go because a man named Vernon Holt had built a dam out of dirt and convenience on someone else's drainage easement 20 years ago. He was standing in the bowl on that dry July morning when the truck pulled up on the county road. He heard it, but did not turn around immediately, because men who are reading ground do not stop reading it on account of traffic. When he turned, the truck was parked, and Dale Whitmore was at the fence, one boot on the lower wire, looking at Caleb across the distance. Caleb walked to the fence. Dale looked at the bowl, at the exposed ground, at the pattern of receding water pooling at the low points. He looked at it for a while before he spoke. "Interesting summer for that ground," Dale said. "Dry summer helps," Caleb said. "Dry summer helps a lot of things." Dale was quiet. Then he said, without looking at Caleb, "I have got a proposition for you. Full price, current appraisal, whatever the bank values this parcel at today, I will pay you that plus 10%. Cash transaction. You walk out of here whole and then some." Caleb looked at Dale for a moment. He looked at the big man with his hands on the fence wire and his eyes still on the bowl, and he understood something that he had only partly understood before, which was that the offer was not generosity. The offer was fear. A man who is not afraid of what you are doing does not show up at your fence on a Tuesday morning in July with cash in his mouth. "No," Caleb said. Dale finally looked at him. "Just no." "Just no." Dale nodded slowly. He took his boot off the fence wire and straightened up. He was quiet for another moment, and then he looked at Caleb in a way that was different from all his previous looks, without the professional warmth, without the dealership smile, with something that was older and less social. "You are a stubborn man, Caleb Marsh." "I am patient," Caleb said. "There is a difference." Dale walked back to his truck and drove away. Caleb watched him go. He stood at the fence for a moment and then turned back to the bowl and continued walking it, feeling the soil under him, reading it, making notes. He had a harvest to plan and a winter of tiling work ahead of him and a legal case moving through the courts at its own pace. 6 weeks later, on the 18th of August 1965, Caleb came out to the property at first light to find 15 acres of his soybean crop in the northwest corner of the upper ground destroyed. The plants were not diseased. They were not insect damaged. They were burned, black, and collapsed, the stalks brittle and the pods shriveled, in a pattern that covered exactly the section of ground nearest the county road access point to the property. It had happened overnight. No lightning, no drought stress. The surrounding plants were healthy. Something had moved through those 15 acres in the dark and left nothing alive behind it. The county sheriff's deputy took a report. He walked the perimeter of the burned section and made notes and said he would look into it. He found nothing. There was no accelerant smell remaining after 3 days of August heat. There were no tire tracks that could be definitively distinguished from Caleb's own. The investigation went nowhere. in the quiet, resigned way that rural investigations often go nowhere when the people capable of providing information have reasons not to provide it. Caleb stood in the burned section on the morning after the sheriff's deputy left. The ash of his crop was black against the dark soil. 15 acres, roughly 100 bushels of yield, at current projections, $220 in revenue, gone. He was standing in a loss that would hurt him this season, a loss that had been deliberately created by someone who wanted to send him a message about the cost of continuing. He looked at the burned ground for a long time. He thought about his father, working rented ground his whole life, and the letter in 30 days. He thought about Vernon Holt's lawyer and 40 pages of argument. He thought about Dale Whitmore at the fence with cash in his mouth and then without the smile. He looked at the black stubble of his destroyed crop and felt something move through him that was neither grief nor rage, but a kind of clarifying cold. The temperature that everything drops to when you have been shown exactly who you are dealing with and exactly what they are capable of, and you have decided that it changes nothing. He pulled his notebook out of his jacket pocket. He found a clean page. He wrote the date, August 19th, 1965. He wrote 15 acres, northwest corner. He wrote estimated loss, $220. Then he looked at the horizon for a moment, at the flat Missouri sky above his land, and he wrote one more line. They are afraid. Keep going. He put the notebook away. He walked back to the farmhall and started it, and drove it to the far end of the property and began preparing the ground. In a section he had planned to leave fallow that season, because he still had seed in the barn and the planting window, while late was not completely closed, and a man who stops planting because someone burned his field is a man who has already lost the argument. He planted 4 acres of late soybeans in the burned section where the soil tested clean enough, and he left the rest as cover crop. It was not a recovery, it was a statement. The kind of statement that is made not with words, but with the simple fact of continuing, which is the most honest statement a man can make about what he intends. He did not know, on that August morning, in the ash of his burned crop, what was waiting for him in the geology 40 inches below his feet. He did not know about the white clay. He did not know what it was worth or what it would mean. He did not know that the destruction of 15 acres of soybeans on a Tuesday night in August was about to become the least important thing that had happened to him that year, because in September, when he pulled his tile plow through the northwest corner, preparing the soil for the cover crop seeding, the plow blade came up dragging a substance that was not the dark Putnam silt loam he had been working all season. It was white, dense and smooth and white, the color of chalk or unglazed porcelain, and it came up in thick slabs that broke cleanly and dried on the soil's surface in the afternoon sun into pieces that rang faintly when you tapped them together. He stopped the farmhall and climbed down and picked up a piece and turned it in his hands. He had seen this material before, once, years ago, on a farm in Boone County, east of Columbia, where a foundation contractor had cut a trench through a clay seam and stopped work for 3 days, while someone from the university came to assess what he had found. The contractor had packed a sample in a coffee can, and the man from the university had held it in both hands and said one word before he reached for his field notebook. Kaolin, hydrous aluminum silicate, industrial clay of considerable commercial value used in paper manufacturing, ceramics, rubber compounds, and a dozen other industrial processes. It occurred in specific geological formations in certain parts of Missouri, and the formation that produced it was typically found at depths of 30 to 60 inches below the surface. He had just pulled his tile plow through a seam of it. Caleb stood in the northwest corner of his burned field on a September afternoon in 1965, holding a piece of white clay in both hands, and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the ground around him. He looked at the scope of his property, the 120 acres, the 40 in the bowl, the 30 in the transitional zone, the 50 on the upper ground, and he thought about what it meant if the Collin Formation ran under more than one corner. He put the piece of clay in his jacket pocket. He started the farmhand. He drove to 3 other locations on the property and put the tile plow in the ground at each one, pulling test trenches, and at 2 of the 3 locations the plow came up white. He drove home that evening and sat at his kitchen table for a very long time without opening his notebook. The burned field, the legal case, Dale Whitmore at the fence, the water that had nowhere to go, and the water that had been going the wrong place for 20 years. And under all of it, 60 inches down, invisible and patient and worth more per ton than soybeans, a seam of white clay running through his ground that no one who had failed here before him had ever dug deep enough to find. He thought about what his father had said. Water is the story. Everything else is chapters. He understood now that his father had been more right than even his father knew. The water had kept everyone else out. The water had made the ground worthless, had made it marginal, had made it the worst farm in Calloway County for 40 years. And that same water, by keeping everyone out, had preserved what was underneath it, undiscovered, untouched, lying in the dark geology of Missouri, waiting with the patience of a thing that does not know it is waiting. He opened his notebook. He turned to the page where he had written, "They are afraid. Keep going." He read it once. Then he turned to a new page and wrote one line. "They do not know what they are afraid of yet." He closed the notebook. Outside, the October wind moved across the land. His land, carrying the smell of harvest and turned earth, and the particular iron scent of Missouri clay after rain. And if there was a line between the land that was his and the land that was not, the wind did not know where it was and did not care. What Caleb did next required more discipline than the tile laying or the tractor work or even the quiet endurance of the legal case. It required the discipline of doing nothing visible with information that was worth a great deal. He had found something under his ground that changed the economics of the property so completely that the soybean operation, with all its promise, was almost secondary. But to exploit it prematurely, to let it become known before he had protected his position, would be to hand a weapon to the men who were already trying to remove him from this land. He understood this with the instinct of a man who had been taught to read situations the same way his father had taught him to read ground, slowly, with attention to what the surface is hiding rather than what it is showing. He drove to Columbia in October and spent 2 days in the geology library at the University of Missouri, reading everything available about kaolin formations in central Missouri, their distribution, their depth ranges, their commercial specifications, and the process by which a landowner could have a deposit assayed and evaluated without triggering a public record. He took notes in his small, precise handwriting in the same notebook where he tracked his yields and his legal case and his tile footage laid. He did not speak to anyone at the university about his specific property. He asked general questions about formation types and received general answers, and thanked the graduate student who helped him locate the relevant surveys and drove back to Calloway County in the dark. He engaged a private assay firm in St. Louis under a non-disclosure agreement that George Pell drafted for $45. The assayer came to the property on a Saturday in November when the county road was quiet. and pulled core samples from 7 locations across the property using equipment that looked, to any passing observer, like routine soil testing. The samples went to St. Louis in sealed containers. The report came back in January of 1966. The Calloway Formation ran beneath approximately 65 acres of the property, including 30 acres of the bowl that had been underwater. The deposit ranged from 4 to 9 feet in thickness and began at an average depth of 42 inches below the surface. The clay quality was assessed as high grade, suitable for premium paper coating applications and fine ceramics. The assayer's preliminary valuation, based on estimated tonnage and current market prices, placed the deposit's commercial value between $400,000 and $700,000, depending on extraction method and market conditions. Caleb read the report 3 times at his kitchen table on a January evening in 1966. The wood stove was going and the farmhouse was warm, and outside the Missouri winter had the land locked under 6 inches of snow that had fallen the week before and not yet thawed. The number on the page was $600,000 at the midpoint estimate. He had paid $4,800 for the land. He had built something under his feet. Below the water and the clay and the failed crops of 4 previous owners, that was worth more than the entire annual agricultural output of the surrounding 10 farms combined. He put the report in the same envelope as the deed and the 1887 survey and the court order and locked them in the tin box under his bed. Then he went back to the wood stove and sat with a cup of coffee and thought about Vernon Holt and Dale Whitmore, and about the burned field, and about the particular nature of men who believe they understand the complete value of a thing they are trying to take from you. They did not know about the clay. Nobody did. And he intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as it served him. Tomorrow there was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And Caleb Marsh had never once in his life confused the work with the destination. There is a particular quality to the silence of a man who knows something that the men trying to destroy him do not know. It is not arrogance. It is not the silence of a man who feels superior. It is something quieter and more fundamental than that. It is the silence of a man who understands that time is on his side in a way that his opponents cannot yet perceive, and who has therefore made peace with every difficulty in the present, because he can see with the clarity of a long view where the present is going. Caleb Marsh carried that silence through the winter of 1966 and into the spring planting season and through the summer that followed, and into the years beyond that. He carried it the way a man carries a thing that is too valuable to show and too important to put down. He got up every morning before light and drove to the Sunken 40 and worked the ground that was workable and tiled the ground that needed tiling and watched the legal case move through the courts at its own pace. And he said nothing to anyone about the white clay under his feet, and he saved his money and paid his bills and noted his yields in his notebook with the same precise handwriting he had used since the first entry on April the 9th, 1963. The soybean yields on the upper and transitional ground continued to outperform the county average by margins that had stopped surprising the elevator operators in Fulton and started becoming something they simply expected from the marsh ground. In 1967, his yield on the tiled sections reached 54 bushels per acre against a county average of 31. In 1968, it was 57. Farmers who drove this county road past his property had stopped making jokes about the Sunken 40 sometime around 1966, and by 1968, they had started using a different word for it, one that came out reluctantly in the way that acknowledgement always comes reluctantly from men who had been publicly wrong. They called it the Marsh Place now, not the Sunken 40, not the Mud Bowl or any name that belonged to failure, the Marsh Place, which meant it had become, in the informal geography of the county, a place defined by its owner rather than its problems. That was a different kind of recognition than any yield number could convey. Caleb began selling kaolin to a ceramics supply company in St. Louis in the fall of 1967. He did it quietly and in quantities small enough not to attract the kind of attention that would require explanation. He had negotiated the arrangement through George Pell's office under a separate business entity he had registered as Marshland Resources, and the invoices went to a post office box in Columbia. The ceramics company paid $42 per ton for high-grade kaolin meeting their specifications, and Caleb's initial extraction, done with the farm awl and a modified bucket attachment he had built over the winter, yielded roughly 8 tons per week from the test area in the northwest corner. That was $336 per week from material that existed 42 inches below ground, that everyone in the county still considered marginal agricultural land. He did not change his life in any visible way. He did not buy a new truck. He did not expand his equipment beyond what the farming operation required. He continued to live in the rented house outside Oxvasse and drive the same vehicle and wear the same work clothes and carry the same notebook. The money went into the Calloway County bank account, and then when that account reached a level that felt exposed, into a savings account at a bank in Columbia, where no one in the county would see the balance. He was building something that had no visible shape yet, the way a foundation has no visible shape when it is below ground, but determines the dimensions of everything that will eventually stand above it. The legal case reached its second significant phase in the spring of 1969. The special master, appointed by Judge Whitfield, had spent 2 years reviewing the drainage situation and had produced a report that ran to 60 pages and concluded with the measured precision of a man who has been paid to be thorough that the 1887 easement was valid, that Vernon Holt's berm had been constructed without authorization on a recorded drainage right-of-way, and that the appropriate remedy was either removal of the berm or construction of an alternative outlet that provided equivalent drainage function to the parcel belonging to Caleb Marsh. He recommended the former as the more practicable solution. Holt's attorney, Driscoll, filed objections to the special master's report. The objections were substantive and well-crafted, and bought Holt another 18 months before Judge Whitfield could schedule the final hearing. Caleb read the objections in George Pell's office and listened to Pell explain what they meant for the timeline, and then drove to the Sunken 40 and walked to the eastern boundary and looked at the berm that had now been standing as an obstruction to his recorded easement for approximately 25 years. He was 32 years old. He had been fighting this berm since he was 26. He had farmed around it and tiled around it and built a business under it and carried a legal case against it for 6 years, and it was still standing. He looked at it in the April afternoon light, at the cedar trees that had grown another 4 inches on its crown, at the fescue grass that was greening up in the warming weather, and he felt nothing in particular toward it, which was itself a kind of information. He did not hate it. He did not resent it. He simply observed it as an object in a landscape that was otherwise proceeding exactly according to his understanding of it, and which would continue to proceed in that direction regardless of whether the berm stood or fell next year or the year after. He turned away from it and drove to the elevator in Fulton to check the current soybean futures. The hearing before Judge Whitfield took place in October of 1970. It was the 4th time Caleb had sat at the plaintiff's table in the Calloway County Courthouse, and by now The ritual of it had the quality of a recurring season, something that came around on its own schedule and required preparation and attention, and then ended and left the landscape changed by some increment that was not always immediately visible. Judge Whitfield heard both sides for 2 days and retired to consider the case, which he had been considering in various forms for 7 years. His ruling came in December of 1970. It was 11 pages long. It found in favor of Caleb Marsh on every substantive point. It ordered Vernon Holt to remove the berm within 90 days or grant Calloway County the authority to remove it at Holt's expense. It awarded Caleb $1,200 in damages for the interference with the drainage easement over the period of the dispute. It did not address the burned field, because there had never been sufficient evidence to connect that event to any named defendant, and Caleb had not included it in his claims, because he understood that the things you cannot prove in court are sometimes better held in your own accounting than submitted to someone else's. Vernon Holt removed the berm in February of 1971. He did it with his own equipment, a crawler dozer that worked for 3 days in the cold February mud. And when the last section of the berm was pushed aside and the outlet channel ran clear, for the first time in 25 years, the water in the Sunken 40 bowl began to move. Slowly at first, then with gathering purpose, finding the grade that had always been there waiting for it, moving through the cleared channel toward the creek in a steady, quiet flow that had the quality of something being corrected after a long error. Caleb was there when it happened. He stood at the edge of the bowl on a cold February morning and watched the water level drop by visible increments over the course of 2 hours. Not dramatic, not sudden, just steady and irreversible, the way water moves when it finally has somewhere to go. By March, the bowl held puddles rather than a pond. By April, it was firm enough to walk. By May, it was ready to plant. He put soybeans in the bowl that spring for the first time. All 40 acres of it, the ground that had been underwater since before he was born. The ground that 4 farmers had looked at and turned away from. The ground that Dale Whitmore and Vernon Holt and the men connected to them had spent 7 years and considerable money and at least 1 act of deliberate destruction to keep him from reaching. The yield that fall was 61 bushels per acre, on ground that the county assessor had classified as marginal to non-productive, on ground that had spent 40 years as a pond. 61 bushels per acre off the worst 40 acres in Calloway County, because the worst 40 acres in Calloway County had been accumulating fertility in its waterlogged darkness for decades, and now had nowhere to put it except into the plants that finally had room to grow. The elevator operator in Fulton, a man named Gaines, who had been weighing Caleb's load since 1963, looked at the yield ticket and then looked at Caleb with an expression that was somewhere between professional respect and genuine bewilderment. "That is the bowl ground," Gaines said. "That is the bowl ground," Caleb said. Gaines shook his head slowly. He did not say anything else. Some things in agricultural counties communicate themselves adequately in silence. The years between 1971 and 1978 were the years of building. Caleb tiled the bowl ground comprehensively over 2 winters, laying 4,000 additional feet of tile in a grid pattern that gave every acre of it controlled drainage to the outlet channel. He expanded the kaolin extraction operation incrementally, adding a small loader and a screening unit that improved the quality consistency of his output and allowed him to supply 2 additional customers, a paper mill in Memphis and a rubber compound manufacturer outside Kansas City. He bought the first additional parcel in 1973, 40 acres of poorly drained bottomland on the north side of his original property, at a price of $380 an acre from a farmer named Beckett, who was retiring and had no children, who wanted the ground. He paid cash. He bought a second parcel in 1975, 60 acres on the western boundary, at $290 an acre from an estate sale, paid cash, and spent the following 2 winters tiling it into production. He was now farming 220 acres, all of it poorly drained land that he had acquired below market value and improved through the same combination of drainage knowledge and patient labor that he had applied to the original 120. The yields across all of it were consistent and high. The county average for soybeans in 1976 was 34 bushels per acre. Caleb's average across all his ground was 58. He was outperforming the county average by 70% on land that had been assessed at a fraction of the value of the upland farms that surrounded it. The people who had shaken their heads at the courthouse auction in 1963 had stopped shaking their heads around 1971, when the bowl ground yielded 61 bushels in its first planted season. By 1976, there was a different quality to the way men spoke about Caleb Marsh in Calloway County, a quality that had the texture of reluctant education, the specific tone that men adopt when they are learning something from a source they initially dismissed and are not entirely comfortable acknowledging it. Dale Whitmore was still operating his equipment dealership. The boom years of the early and middle 1970s had been good to him, as they had been good to every equipment dealer in the Midwest. Corn prices climbed and land values followed, and farmers borrowed against rising valuations to buy machinery they had always wanted and now felt justified purchasing. And Dale's lot was busy, and his finance operation was busier, and he expanded into a second building and hired 2 additional mechanics and a salesman, and acquired the Alice Chalmers franchise for the county in addition to his existing lines. He and Caleb had not spoken in the way of men who have conducted any real conversation since the morning at the fence in the dry summer of 1965, when Caleb had said just no, and Dale had used the word stubborn and driven away. They saw each other at the co-op and at the elevator and at the Farm Bureau meetings that Caleb attended with the regular and unremarkable presence of a working farmer managing a serious operation, and they acknowledged each other with the minimal courtesy that men in small agricultural counties maintain with one another regardless of what lies between them, because the county is small and the seasons are long and there is no practical alternative to a functional surface of civility over whatever complexity exists below it. Vernon Holt had retired from farming in 1972, the year after the berm came down. His 300 acres went to his son, who farmed them adequately without distinction, and the drainage infrastructure that Holt Sr. had built his operation around was modified at considerable expense after the outlet through Caleb's property was closed off by the court order. The Holt operation tiled properly now, running their drainage to a county ditch on the north side rather than through the corner of Caleb's ground, and the cost of doing that correctly was several $1,000s that Holt Sr. had avoided paying for 25 years by using the Sunken 40 as his free drainage basin. Caleb noted these developments in his notebook with the same flat precision he used for everything else. Not with satisfaction exactly, with accuracy. He was keeping a record of what had happened and what it had cost each party to the situation, because he believed that a clear record, maintained without sentiment, was the only honest way to understand a sequence of events. The farm crisis arrived in Calloway County in the winter of 1982, the way most agricultural catastrophes arrive, which is not as a single event, but as the convergence of several bad conditions into a situation that anyone could have predicted in retrospect and almost no one had prepared for in advance. Interest rates climbed into the high teens. Land values, which had been the collateral base for the expansion borrowing of the previous decade, dropped by 40 and then 50%. The corn and soybean prices that had justified the equipment purchases and the land acquisitions of the boom years fell back toward levels that made servicing the debt on those acquisitions mathematically impossible. Caleb had not borrowed during the boom. He had not borrowed at any point since buying the Sunken 40 in 1963, which meant he had not paid for his expansion by pledging the rising value of his ground against loans that the falling value of his ground could no longer support. He was not, as the farm crisis winter settled into Calloway County, carrying a single dollar of agricultural debt. His 220 acres were owned outright. His equipment, which was modest by the standards of the operators who had expanded aggressively, was paid for. His savings accounts in Fulton and Columbia held, between them, a balance that he did not discuss with anyone but that George Pell knew about, because he was the only professional Caleb had ever fully trusted, and Pell had counseled him for 15 years to keep it diversified and conservative and documented. Dale Whitmore entered the winter of 1982 in a different position. The dealership had expanded on the assumption that the farmers of Calloway County would continue to service their equipment notes as their operations grew and their land values supported the debt. When the land values collapsed and the farm income dropped, and the notes went into default, Dale's finance operation found itself holding paper on equipment that was worth 60 cents on the dollar and owned by farmers who could not make the payments. He had also borrowed against the dealership's real estate to finance the expansion into the second building and the acquisition of the Alice Chalmers franchise, and those loans were with a regional bank in Columbia that was itself under pressure from agricultural loan losses across its portfolio. The situation became visible to the county slowly and then all at once, the way all situations of that kind become visible. By the spring of 1983, Dale had let one mechanic go. By the fall of 1983, the second building was idle. By 1984, the Alice Chalmers franchise had been surrendered, and the salesman had found work elsewhere, and the lot, which had been full of bright green machinery in 1979, held a reduced inventory of used equipment in various states of maintenance. Caleb watched this from the distance, appropriate to a man who was not involved in it and did not wish to appear to be observing it, which is to say, he watched it the way everyone in the county watched it, from the natural vantage point of daily life in a small agricultural community where everyone's situation is eventually visible to everyone else. What he was also watching, with considerably more personal interest, was the land market. In 1983, the first foreclosure auction in the southeast drainage basin came up on the courthouse steps, 80 acres of bottomland belonging to a farmer named Sorrell, who had borrowed against peak value and could not survive the correction. Caleb was there. He bid carefully, aware that the land was worth what it could produce rather than what the bank had lent against, and he bought the 80 acres for $260 an acre, which was below what the bank had lent on it and approximately what Caleb's own analysis told him it was worth in its current undrained condition. He knew what it was worth in its drained condition. He had known that kind of calculation his entire adult life. He bought a second foreclosure parcel in 1984, 60 acres at $280 an acre from the Garland estate, which was one of the operations that Dale Whitmore had financed most heavily during the boom, and which had come apart with the particular completeness that heavily leveraged agricultural operations come apart when the mathematics reverse. He bought a third parcel in 1985, another 40 acres at $240 an acre, 380 acres now, all in the southeast basin, all of it poor draining ground that he understood better than anyone in Missouri, and that he was converting year by year into some of the most consistently productive farmland in the county. In the fall of 1986, Dale Whitmore sold the equipment dealership to a group from Jefferson City. He sold it for less than it had been worth in 1979 and more than it would have been worth if he had waited another year, which was the best available outcome of a situation that had no good outcomes remaining. He retained ownership of the real estate the dealership sat on, which was a piece of strategic thinking that would serve him in the years following. But the franchise, the inventory, the customer accounts, and the business that his name had been synonymous with in Calloway County for 30 years, those were gone. He retired to a house on a small acreage on the north side of Fulton. He was 75 years old, and the retirement was not the retirement of a man who has built what he intended to build and is now stepping back from it in satisfaction. It was the retirement of a man who has watched something end and is trying to find a way to occupy the time that remains with some dignity. Caleb heard about the sale from Harold Estes at the co-op in the same casual, sideways manner that all information moved in Calloway County. He noted it in his notebook. He did not visit Dale. He did not call. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said, and Caleb had never been a man who required his own positions to be verbalized in order to be real. What happened next came from a direction that he had not anticipated, and in 30 years of farming, the Sunken 40 and the ground surrounding it, there had been very few things that Caleb Marsh had not anticipated. He was sitting in the kitchen of the farmhouse he now owned, having purchased it from his landlord in 1974 with cash on a Wednesday evening in March of 1987, when he heard a car in the drive that he did not recognize by sound. He stood at the window and looked out. It was a sedan, not a truck, which in Calloway County already told you something. The woman who got out of it was perhaps 60 years old, well-dressed in the way of a woman who has taken care with her appearance for so long. It has become simply how she moves through the world. And she walked to the door with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has made a difficult decision and is executing it before she can change her mind. He opened the door before she knocked. She looked at him. "Mrs. Sandra Whitmore," she said. "I am Dale's wife. I expect you know who I am." He stepped back from the door. She came in. He poured coffee because that was what you did in a farmhouse kitchen, regardless of the circumstances, and they sat at the table across from each other with the notebooks and the county maps and the plat copies that were the permanent furniture of his working life spread across the surface between them. She looked at the maps for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at him. "I owe you something," she said. "I have been deciding for 20 years whether to give it to you, and I have decided." He waited. "In March of 1963, she said, 6 weeks before that courthouse auction, Dale came home from a meeting. He had been to see Vernon Holt and 2 other men, and the meeting was about the Sunken 40. Dale had received a geological survey report from a company that had been doing exploratory work in the southeast basin. The report identified a kaolin clay deposit of significant commercial value under approximately 60 acres of that property. Dale and the others had a plan to acquire the land, clear the legal situation around the drainage easement through a combination of legal pressure and negotiated buyout, drain the bowl ground, and extract the clay commercially before returning the surface to agricultural use. Caleb's hands were flat on the table. His face was completely still. They needed the land to stay in failed hands until they were ready to move, she continued. Every time the county auctioned it, they needed it to go to someone who would fail on it, so the price would stay low and the situation would stay manageable. They had managed that twice before you came along. The previous buyer, before Gideon Pruitt, was also not an accident. He was a man they knew would give up. She paused. She looked at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her. "I am not a woman who involves herself in her husband's business dealings," she said. "I never have been. But I had seen what he and those men had done to two previous families on that ground, and I knew what they were planning for the next one. I could not stop him from doing what he did. But I thought, if the right person bought that land, someone who understood what was actually there, someone who could protect it, then whatever Dale and Holt tried to do would not work." She reached into her purse and set a document on the table. It was a geological survey report, dated January of 1963, on letterhead that Caleb recognized because it was the same assay firm he had later hired himself, under a different lead geologist. The report was a preliminary assessment of kaolin deposits in the southeast drainage basin of Calloway County, Missouri. It named the parcel. It described the formation. It estimated the deposit's commercial value in a range that was close to what Caleb's own assay had concluded 4 years later. "I sent you a copy of this in April of 1963, she said, "the week before the auction. I sent it anonymously to the address listed in the Farm Bureau directory for a farmhand named C. Marsh in Oxvass." Caleb looked at the document on the table. He thought back to April of 1963, to the days before the auction, to the pile of mail on the table in his rented room. He had received something, a manila envelope with no return address. He had opened it and found a document inside and had read it, and it had confirmed something he had already suspected from his own ground observations and from the memory of that afternoon in Boone County years before, when a contractor had pulled white clay from a Missouri trench and a man from the university had reached for his field notebook. He had filed the document with the rest of his research materials and had never thought to question where it came from. He looked at Sandra Whitmore. "You sent it," he said. She nodded. "I sent it because I wanted the right person to buy that land and know what was in it and be able to hold it against whatever Dale tried to do. I did not know if anyone would act on it. I did not know if it would go to someone who could read it and understand what it meant. When you bought the land and started working it and held on through everything that came at you, I understood that you had received it and used it. But I could not tell you. Not while Dale was still in a position where telling you would have cost him something he had not yet lost." She paused. "Now he has lost it, and I am 60 years old, and I am tired of carrying things that belong to someone else." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock on the wall above the stove moved through half a minute. Outside, the March wind was doing what March wind does in Missouri, which is to make the bare trees speak in the particular language of a season that has not yet decided what it is. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally, "you did not send me a map to a piece of ground. You sent me the reason to buy it, the reason to hold it when they burned my field, the reason to stay in that courtroom for 7 years. Everything I built here, I built because I knew what was underneath it. I knew because of what you sent." She looked at him. Her eyes were steady. "You built it," she said. "I just made sure you could see what you were building on." He thought about his father. He thought about reading water and reading ground, and reading the thing that lies underneath the visible surface of a situation. He thought about the way his father had said it. Not once, but many times, in many forms, but always arriving at the same essential truth. The water shows you where to look. What you find when you look is yours to deal with. Sandra Whitmore had sent him a document, but what she had actually sent him was the same thing his father had spent a lifetime trying to give him, which was the ability to see past the surface of a thing to what it was actually worth. She had recognized something in the landscape of the situation, a man who could receive that kind of information and act on it correctly, and she had made a decision that was quiet and irreversible and had shaped everything that followed. She had done it alone, without support, without acknowledgement, and she had carried it for 24 years. He said, "I think you may have saved this farm before I ever set foot on it." She looked down at her hands. Then she stood and he stood, and she picked up the survey document from the table and held it out to him. "This belongs with your records," she said. He took it. They walked to the door. Outside, the March evening was grey and cold, and the land on all sides of the farmhouse was his, all 380 acres of it draining correctly into the creek through the outlet channel that had been cleared and the tile system he had laid foot by foot across 30 years, and the kaolin extraction operation that had been running quietly for 20 years and had generated enough revenue to buy his neighbor's failed ground and tile it into production and build an operation that no bank held a claim on. She walked to her car. At the door, she turned once. He was a hard man in some ways, she said, meaning Dale, but he was not always wrong about things. The day after you bought that land, he came home and told me that young Marsh had a different idea about the ground, and he did not know what it was. He said it in a way that I had not heard him speak about a competitor before. He said it like a man who was genuinely uncertain, and Dale was not a man who was often uncertain. She got in her car and drove down the lane and turned onto the county road and was gone. Caleb stood in the doorway of the farmhouse for a while. The evening was settling in. The fields around the house were bare and dark in the last light, and in the distance, where the eastern boundary ran along the creek, the willows were just beginning to show the first faint green of early spring growth, that tentative color that appears before anyone is sure winter is finished, the color of a thing that is not yet certain it is safe to begin. He went back inside. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his notebook to a new page. He looked at the blank page for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote the date, March 11th, 1987. He wrote Sandra Whitmore. He wrote the facts of what she had told him, in the flat, precise sequence he used for everything, without editorializing, because the facts did not require it. Then, at the bottom of the page, he wrote one line that was different from his usual accounting. She saw what was possible before either of us did anything about it. He closed the notebook. The kaolin extraction contract with the paper mill in Memphis ran until 1993, when the formation in the northwest sector was substantially depleted at economically viable extraction depth. Over 26 years of operation, the Marshland Resources account had received a total of $840,000 in kaolin revenue. Caleb had disclosed the operation to the IRS annually, paid his taxes on it correctly, and otherwise maintained the same silence about it that he had maintained since the fall of 1965, when the tile plow first came up white. He had never applied for permits that would have created public records. He had never scaled the operation to a size that required employees. He had never, in any conversation with any person in Calloway County, mentioned the clay. When the extraction concluded in 1993 and the northwest sector was returned to agricultural use, the ground there grew soybeans the following spring at 63 bushels per acre, because the process of clay extraction had left the topsoil structure intact and in some areas had improved the drainage characteristics of the subsoil. The ground that had been a quiet industrial operation in the fall became a productive farm field in the spring, and no one who drove past it on the county road could tell the difference between it and the ground around it. Caleb turned the operation over to his son Russell in 1998. Russell was 34 years old and had grown up on the farm and understood drainage and soil and the particular philosophy of patient accumulation that his father had practiced without ever quite labeling it as a philosophy. He was a different kind of farmer than his father in some ways, more willing to use credit for equipment, more comfortable with the scale of modern agricultural operations, but the core of how he approached the ground was the same, because you cannot grow up watching a man work the way Caleb worked without absorbing the grammar of it, even when you cannot yet name the language. At the transfer, Caleb walked Russell across the full 380 acres on a September morning when the soybeans were in full canopy and the drainage ditches were running clear from a rain 3 days before. He showed Russell the outlet channel on the eastern boundary, cleared now for nearly 30 years, and told him the history of the berm and the legal case and the 7 years it had taken to win the right to use the drainage easement that had belonged to the land since 1887. He showed him the sections where the Calloway formation had been extracted and described the care required to manage that transition back to agricultural use. He showed him the original 40-acre bowl that had been underwater for 40 years before the first crop went in, and where the yield now exceeded everything around it. At the end of the walk, they stood at the farmyard fence and looked at the whole of what they had been over. The sky above the Missouri land was the particular blue of a September morning that has burned off its early cloud cover and settled into the clear, permanent quality of a day that intends to hold. The soybeans stretched in every direction, dark and heavy, a week from cutting, and the silence over them was the silence of a harvest ready to happen. Russell said, "How did you know, in 1963, that it would work?" Caleb looked at the fields. He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know it would work," he said. "I knew the water had somewhere to go if someone would clear the way for it. The rest was work." Russell looked at him. "What about the clay? What about the legal case? What about the burned field?" Caleb looked at his son. He looked at the 35 years of work visible in the land around them, in the drainage system running under it, and the tile lines, and the cleared outlet channel, and the bowl ground that yielded 61 bushels in its first season and had never stopped since. "Your grandfather told me," he said, "that water does not lie. You learn to read water, and you learn to read land. What I learned from this ground was something beyond that. I learned that you can read people the same way." Dale Whitmore looked at this property and saw an obstacle. Vernon Holt looked at it and saw a tool. Gideon Pruitt looked at it and saw a defeat. Your grandfather looked at ground like this his whole life and saw the book inside it, and he tried to teach me to read it, and I did not understand what he meant until I stood in that bowl in April of 1963 with water up to my boot tops and a deed in my pocket. He paused. What I saw was not what it was. What I saw was what it was going to be. Russell was quiet. The September morning held them in its particular light. Caleb put his hand on the fence post, the same cedar post he had set in the ground himself in the winter of 1964, which was still sound and still plumb, because cedar set correctly does not fail in the lifetime of the man who sets it. The county assessor reclassified this land in 1972, he said, changed the designation from marginal agricultural to prime farmland. Same dirt, same clay, same low ground that sat underwater for 40 years. The only thing that changed was where the water went. He took his hand off the post and put it in his jacket pocket. "What is the difference between worthless land and prime land?" he said. About 30 years of knowing where the water belongs. That is all. That is the whole answer. They walked back to the farmhouse. The soybeans moved in the light September wind, the whole 380 acres of them, in the slow, continuous motion of a thing that has arrived at exactly where it should be after a very long journey. The drainage ditches ran clear. The outlet channel on the eastern boundary carried the water of the southeast basin to the creek in the quiet, unhurried way of something doing what it was always meant to do. Under the ground, 42 inches down, the geology held its own record of what had been there and what had been taken and what remained, in the language of pressure and mineral and time that no notebook can fully transcribe. Caleb Marsh had paid $4,800 for this land in 1963. He had paid with every dollar he had in the world. He had paid with 8 years of farm labor and 30 years of patient work, and the particular inheritance of a tenant farmer's son who had been taught to read water and who had never stopped reading it. The land had returned to him more than he could have calculated on the first night he sat at that kitchen table with a notebook and wrote Day 1. What it had returned most completely was not the money, though the money was real and it was considerable, and it had given Russell a foundation to work from that Earl Marsh had never had, and Caleb had built from nothing. What it had returned was a thing that Caleb thought about on the mornings when he walked the eastern boundary and watched the water moving in the outlet channel, moving in the direction it had always needed to move, carrying with it the excess that had once drowned everything it touched and was now simply water, doing what water does when it has been shown the way out. It had returned the proof of something his father had believed without ever having the ground to demonstrate it on, that the land is not what it looks like when you cannot manage the water. The land is what it becomes when you can. And between those two things, between what a piece of ground appears to be and what it actually is, the distance is not measured in acres or dollars or court decisions or years. It is measured in the depth of a man's understanding of the single force that governs all of it. The water, where it comes from, and where it goes, and what it leaves behind when it finally finds its way. Earl Marsh had spent his life reading that story on other men's ground. His son had found a place to write it in his own name, and the writing had taken 30 years and every dollar he had, and the inheritance of a way of seeing that no school had given him, and no bank could hold as collateral, and no man could take when he drove away in a truck from a courthouse with an auction behind him and a deed in his jacket and $11 in his wallet. The worst farm in Calloway County, the best investment anyone in that county ever made. All it took was a man who knew where the water wanted to go and had the patience to show it the way.